I was rinsing out my coffee mug when my son called and asked if I was home. That was the first thing that made me pause. Mike never asked that. He usually called while driving, talked through the truck speakers, and started wherever his mind already was. Work, the kids, a problem with the insurance company, a funny thing his youngest had said at breakfast. That evening, his voice was quieter. I told him I was home. I had been home most of the day. At 68, retired for 3 years, I had learned there was a difference between being alone and being lonely. Most days I managed the first just fine. The second came and went. It helped to keep a routine. Coffee at 7, walk at 8 if the weather held, groceries on Tuesday, yard work when my knees allowed it, dinner at the same oak table where my wife Ellen had once sorted coupons and corrected our son's spelling homework. Mike said he and Lauren needed to come by. I looked out the kitchen window. It was late September, just after sunset, the kind of evening when the street lights came on before the sky had fully gone dark. The maple tree in the front yard was starting to turn red at the edges. I asked if everything was all right. He did not answer right away. Then he said, "We just need to talk to you in person, Dad." 20 minutes later, headlights swept across the front windows. Not one set, 2. Mike's SUV pulled into the driveway first. Lauren's car stopped behind it. For a moment, nobody got out. I stood just inside the front door, one hand resting on the knob, and watched through the narrow glass panel beside the frame. Mike stepped out first. He looked tired in a way I recognized from my own working years, when bills arrived faster than paychecks and you kept telling yourself next month would be better. Lauren got out of the second car and opened the rear door. My grandson, Ethan, climbed out holding a backpack against his chest. His little sister, Emma, followed with a stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. Then, Mike opened the back of the SUV. There were suitcases inside, not overnight bags, suitcases. I opened the door before they reached the porch. Mike looked at me, then looked away toward the yard. Lauren gave me a small smile that had more effort than warmth in it. The children looked cold and confused. I said hello to them first. Ethan came in for a hug, stiff at the beginning, then tighter. Emma held up the rabbit so I could greet it too. Children have a way of keeping adults from falling apart too soon. Mike stood on the porch with both hands in his jacket pockets. "Dad," he said, "we had to leave the apartment." He said it simply, but nothing about it was simple. I stepped aside and let them into the entryway. Lauren brought in one suitcase, Mike brought in 2. The children took their shoes off without being asked because Ellen had trained them early, and some habits survive even when everything else in a family starts to move. I did not ask questions in the doorway. I had learned that much from 42 years of marriage. Some conversations needed a table. I put water on for tea because I needed something for my hands to do. Lauren sat on the edge of the living room sofa, still wearing her coat. Mike stood near the fireplace, looking at the framed photograph of his mother on the mantel. Ethan and Emma sat on the rug and whispered to each other. The house was quiet, except for the kettle. Mike explained it in pieces. Their lease had ended. The renewal rate was higher than expected. Lauren had lost 2 major clients from her design work in July. Mike's hours had been cut after his company changed territories. They had tried to make it work. They had used savings, then credit cards, then a short-term loan he described too quickly. They were not homeless, exactly, he said, not in the way people usually meant it. But they had nowhere affordable to go on such short notice. Lauren did not interrupt him. She looked at her hands most of the time. Once, when Mike mentioned the credit cards, her mouth tightened. Not anger, embarrassment, maybe, or the exhaustion of hearing a private failure spoken out loud in someone else's house. I listened until he finished. Then I asked how long they needed. Mike said, "Just until we get back on our feet." That was not an answer. Lauren looked up then. "Maybe a month or two," she said. "We don't want to impose, we just need a little breathing room." I believed part of that. I also knew breathing room could become a room, then a drawer, then a garage space, then a new normal nobody had agreed to. I loved my son. I loved those children. I did not want them sleeping in a motel, eating drive-through food off their laps, trying to do homework under bad fluorescent lights. But I also knew my house had become the last place where my life still felt like my own. Ellen was gone 5 years by then, and almost everything else had changed. The grocery store had changed its layout twice. The bank had closed the branch where I knew everyone by name. Mike had a family of his own. Even my body had started negotiating with me before every staircase. The house remained. Not because it was large or valuable, though it was both enough to attract opinions. It remained because every repair, every mark on the doorframe, every faded square on the wall where a picture had once hung, belonged to a life I had built honestly. So I said yes. Lauren let out a breath. Mike closed his eyes for a second. But before either of them could thank me, I held up one hand. "There's something we need to do first." Mike looked at me with the cautious expression people get when relief is interrupted. I went to the small desk in the den. The top drawer stuck unless you lifted it slightly. Inside was a folder I had prepared 6 months earlier after a neighbor's nephew stayed for 2 weeks and was still there by spring. At the time, I had felt foolish printing it, too formal, too cold. Ellen would have teased me for labeling it. But Ellen also believed locks existed for a reason. I brought the folder to the dining room table and set it down. Lauren looked at the cover. Guest agreement. No one spoke for a few seconds. I sat across from them and opened the folder. There were 4 pages, plain language, no legal tricks, no small print. I had written most of it myself, then asked a retired attorney from church to look it over and tell me if I sounded like a man or a landlord. He had said both, which I decided was acceptable. Mike gave a short laugh, but it did not land. "Dad, come on." "I am not refusing to help," I said. "I am making sure helping does not turn into misunderstanding." Lauren's face changed. Not dramatically. She only sat a little straighter. I pushed the papers toward them. They read in silence. The terms were simple: 30 days, with the possibility of 1 written extension if everyone agreed. No rent, but they would buy their own groceries and contribute to utilities. No moving furniture without asking. No changing locks, passwords, accounts, thermostat schedules, service providers, or storage areas. No guests unless I approved first. No business meetings in the house. No discussions about the house, my will, my finances, or future inheritance while they were living there. The children would be treated like family, but the adults would be responsible for them. If the agreement was broken in a serious way, they would leave within 48 hours. At the end, I had added one sentence. This arrangement is help, not a transfer of authority. Mike stopped reading there. Lauren kept going to the signature lines. This feels a little formal, she said. It is formal. We're family. That is why it needs to be clear. The kettle began to whistle in the kitchen. I got up, turned off the burner, and poured the tea. Nobody wanted any, but I poured 3 cups anyway and brought them back. Small, ordinary actions can hold a room together when pride is floating loose in it. Mike rubbed his forehead. We're not trying to take over your house. I did not say you were. Lauren looked at me then, and for the first time that night, I saw something besides worry in her eyes. She was calculating, though not in a villainous way. People do that when they are cornered. They measure the space left to them. 30 days may not be enough, she said. It may not be, I answered. Then why start there? because people work better with a date. Mike stared at the paper. He looked older than 42 at that moment. He had his mother's eyes, especially when he was ashamed. I remembered him at 16, standing beside a dented mailbox after backing into it with my truck, waiting for me to yell. I had not yelled then either. I had handed him a wrench and made him help me fix it. This was not so different. He picked up the pen first. Lauren watched him sign. Then she signed too, slowly, as if her name weighed more than usual. I signed last. Only after that did I stand. Bring in what you need for tonight. The rest can wait until morning. Mike nodded. Lauren folded her copy of the agreement and placed it carefully in her purse. The children had fallen asleep against each other on the sofa, Ethan's head tilted back, Emma's rabbit slipping from her hand. I carried the rabbit to the guest room and turned down the blankets. Mike came down the hall behind me with 2 suitcases. He paused at the bedroom door. "Thank you, Dad." I believed he meant it. I also knew gratitude felt different before breakfast than it did after 3 weeks of inconvenience. That night, after the house settled, I walked through the rooms the way I always did before bed. Front door locked, porch light off, thermostat lowered, kitchen faucet checked. Ellen used to say I acted like a night watchman in my own home. Maybe I did. Maybe every home needs someone willing to notice what changes. In the living room, I stopped beside her chair. It was not a fancy chair, dark green fabric, worn smooth on the arms, angled toward the front window, where she used to watch the school bus stop even after Mike was grown. I had considered giving it away twice. Both times I got as far as putting my hand on the back of it, and then changed my mind. The chair stayed. I looked down the hallway toward the guest room, where my son and his family were sleeping under my roof. I was glad they were safe. I was also glad the agreement was signed. Both things could be true. The first morning began earlier than anyone expected, though not because of an alarm or a disagreement. Old habits simply wake up before people do. I had been getting out of bed a little before 6 for nearly 40 years. Retirement had not changed that. Neither had Ellen's passing. The house was always quiet at that hour, and I liked it that way. I made coffee, opened the blinds above the kitchen sink, and watched the neighborhood wake one porch light at a time. The children were still asleep. So were Mike and Lauren. I stood in the backyard with my coffee for nearly 20 minutes, listening to the sprinkler from the house across the street and watching a pair of squirrels argue over something invisible in the maple tree. It occurred to me that the yard suddenly felt smaller, though nothing had physically changed. Sometimes the simple knowledge that 4 more people were sleeping inside a house altered the feeling of every room around it. When I came back inside, Ethan was already sitting at the kitchen table. He was still wearing yesterday's t-shirt. His hair stuck up on one side, and he looked embarrassed to have been caught awake. "I couldn't find the cereal," he admitted. I smiled and pointed toward the pantry. "Second shelf." He climbed onto a stool to reach it. After pouring himself a bowl, he hesitated. "Mom says I should ask before I use people's stuff." "That's a good habit." He nodded, poured milk, then quietly returned everything exactly where he'd found it. I noticed because children usually don't. Adults usually do. Around 7:30, Mike wandered into the kitchen looking as though he had slept without really resting. He accepted a mug of coffee and stood beside me while Ethan finished breakfast. "I forgot how quiet it is here," he said. "It wasn't always." He smiled faintly. "No." For a while we talked about ordinary things, the elementary school the children would temporarily attend, whether he had heard anything from work, the weather forecast. It was an easy conversation because it stayed away from the reason he was standing in my kitchen. Lauren came downstairs shortly afterward, carrying Emma, who was still half asleep. She thanked me for letting everyone stay, and this time the gratitude sounded more natural than it had the night before. We ate breakfast together. Not a large one. Toast, eggs, fruit. Everyone cleaned up their own dishes without anyone mentioning the agreement. I appreciated that. Sometimes the easiest way to respect a boundary is to pretend it never needed to be written down. Over the next several days, we slowly found a rhythm. Mike left each morning to meet with his manager and search for additional work. Lauren spent hours on her laptop applying for freelance projects while the children attended school. I handled most of my usual routine: grocery shopping, lawn work, small repairs around the house that somehow always appeared when a man had enough free time to notice them. Nothing dramatic happened. In fact, if someone had walked through the front door during that first week, they might have thought we were simply an ordinary, multi-generational family sharing a house. But ordinary living has a way of revealing personalities more honestly than arguments ever do. On Thursday afternoon, I returned from the hardware store carrying a new faucet cartridge for the downstairs bathroom. The front door was unlocked. Not wide open, just unlocked. Inside, I found Lauren in the dining room, surrounded by color samples, fabric swatches, and her laptop. She looked up immediately. "Oh, you're back." "I am." "I hope you don't mind. I needed a larger table." I looked around. Nothing had been moved except the chairs. That mattered. She had not rearranged the room, she had simply used it. "Looks like you're working." She smiled. "I'm trying." That was the end of it. I repaired the faucet while she answered emails. Neither of us interrupted the other. That evening she made spaghetti for everyone. Before dinner she asked where I kept the serving bowls. I showed her. Afterward she washed every dish she had used. Little things matter, not because they solve larger problems, because they reveal intentions before words ever do. By the second week, however, the differences between our ways of living began to appear. They were never large enough to become arguments, only noticeable enough to require conversation. I liked opening the windows whenever the weather cooled down. Lauren preferred the air conditioning because Emma's allergies bothered her. Mike tended to leave his shoes near the garage entrance after work. I had always kept that hallway clear because Ellen hated clutter. The children watched television after dinner. I usually read. None of these habits were wrong. They simply belonged to different households. One afternoon, I walked into the laundry room and noticed my toolbox sitting on a different shelf. It had only moved about 3 feet. I knew immediately I had not put it there. Lauren came in carrying folded towels. "Oh," she said when she saw where I was looking. "I moved it this morning." I nodded. I noticed. "I was trying to make room for the kids' backpacks." "I understand." She waited. I walked over, picked up the toolbox, and returned it to its usual place. Then I turned toward the empty wall opposite us. "There." She looked confused. "There what?" "Now, both things fit." She looked at the shelf again. The backpacks fit perfectly beneath a small wooden bench that had been empty for years. She laughed softly. "I honestly didn't even see that." "I believe you." For a second, she looked almost relieved. "I wasn't trying to change anything." "I know. And I did. That difference mattered." She had solved the problem she saw first. I had solved it differently because I knew the room better. Neither solution came from bad intentions. It came from ownership. That evening, she apologized anyway. I told her no apology was necessary. "Just ask next time." She nodded. "I will." That conversation lasted less than a minute. Had we ignored it, it might have become something much larger weeks later. By the middle of the third week, I began noticing another change. Mike laughed less. Not because anything was wrong inside the house, because every afternoon he returned carrying the same invisible weight: rejection. One employer had frozen hiring. Another position paid too little to support the family. A third wanted relocation 3 states away. He never complained. He simply became quieter. One evening, I found him sitting alone on the back porch after everyone else had gone inside. He was staring at the lawn without really seeing it. "I've sent out 43 applications," he said before I even sat down. I believed him. "You only need one." "I know." "But every rejection feels personal." We sat there without speaking for several minutes. The porch light attracted moths that circled the bulb in slow, silent loops. Finally, he asked something unexpected. "Did Grandpa ever help you?" "My father?" He nodded. "When you and Mom were struggling?" I thought about it. "He offered, but—" I turned him down. Mike looked surprised. "Why?" "Because I needed help learning how to stand, not getting comfortable sitting." He smiled a little. "I sound exactly like Mom." "You do." He rubbed both hands together. "I hate being here." "You don't have to hate it." "I do." He looked toward the kitchen window where Lauren was helping Emma with homework. "I hate that my kids think this is normal." I understood exactly what he meant. Children adapt very quickly. Adults notice what has been lost. Before going inside, I put one hand on his shoulder. "This house is here to help you recover." He nodded. "Not to hide." "Exactly." Nothing else needed saying. The following Saturday morning, Lauren approached me while I was trimming roses along the front walkway. "I wanted to ask you something." I set the shears down. "What is it?" She hesitated longer than usual. "I've been thinking about the agreement." I waited. "I didn't like it." "I know." "But—" She looked toward the house where Ethan was riding his bicycle up and down the driveway. "I think I understand now." She smiled awkwardly. "Not because you don't trust us." I said nothing. "Because you don't want anyone guessing." I looked at her for a long moment. "No, I don't." She nodded slowly. "My parents never had boundaries." I waited again. "When someone stayed, they stayed until everyone hated each other." She gave a small laugh that carried no humor. "They never knew when to have uncomfortable conversations." I remembered something Ellen used to say. Most family problems do not begin with cruelty. They begin with avoidance. I did not repeat that aloud. Instead, I picked up the shears. "Well," I said, "we've managed 3 weeks without hating each other." She laughed, a genuine one this time. "So far." As she walked back toward the house, I realized something had quietly shifted. The agreement was no longer sitting between us like a warning. It had become something else. A shared understanding. Not perfect, not effortless, just clear. Sometimes that is enough to keep ordinary life from becoming something much harder. By the beginning of October, the agreement had almost disappeared from our daily lives. Not because anyone had forgotten it, because it had quietly become routine. Mike found temporary contract work with a commercial maintenance company across town. He'd paid less than his previous position, but he came home each evening looking lighter than he had in weeks. Lauren picked up several new design clients online. The hours were irregular, often stretching late into the night, but work was work. The children settled into their temporary school faster than any of the adults had expected. Life was beginning to resemble something ordinary again. And that, I knew from experience, was when people stopped paying attention. One Tuesday afternoon, I was replacing weather stripping around the back door when Mike came home earlier than usual. He didn't come through the garage. He walked around the side of the house carrying 2 grocery bags. "I stopped at Miller's Market," he said. "Thought I'd cook tonight." I looked inside the bags. Ground beef, fresh vegetables, bread from the bakery downtown. Nothing extravagant. Just enough for dinner. "You didn't have to." "I know," he smiled. "I wanted to." It was the first time since moving in that he had bought groceries without anyone mentioning it. Again, it wasn't about the money. Small decisions often reveal much larger ones. That evening, we ate meatloaf with mashed potatoes while Emma explained in great detail why her third-grade teacher should probably allow classroom hamsters. Ethan insisted that hamsters smelled terrible. Mike pretended to referee the debate. Lauren laughed harder than I had heard her laugh since arriving. For nearly an hour, the house sounded the way houses are supposed to sound. Not exciting, just lived in. After dinner, Mike insisted on washing every dish. I dried them while he worked. "You remember when Mom used to make me do this?" he asked. "I remember you complaining every single time." I thought she was being unfair. "You probably told her." I definitely told her. He rinsed another plate before speaking again. "I didn't understand she wasn't teaching me how to wash dishes." I looked over. What was she teaching? That helping shouldn't depend on who owns the house. I nodded. She'd be pleased you finally figured it out. He smiled without answering. A few days later, something happened that reminded me how quickly comfort can blur boundaries. It was Friday afternoon. I had gone to the public library and stopped for coffee on the way home. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed another vehicle parked along the curb. A white SUV. Unfamiliar. Inside, I found Lauren sitting at the dining room table with a woman about her age. Laptops open, fabric samples spread across the table. Both women looked up immediately. "Oh," Lauren said, standing. "Dad, this is Olivia." Olivia smiled politely and introduced herself as one of Lauren's clients. I shook her hand. She seemed perfectly pleasant. Lauren looked uncomfortable. "I should have asked first." "Yes." "I wasn't thinking." "I know." There wasn't much else to say. Olivia gathered her things almost immediately. "I'm sorry," she said. "No need," I replied. "You didn't know." After she left, Lauren remained standing by the dining room table. "I broke the agreement." "You did." "I honestly wasn't trying to." "I believe you." She looked surprised by that answer. "I'll work somewhere else." "There isn't anywhere else today." She frowned slightly. "I don't understand." "You don't need to leave." She waited. "You only need to remember." She nodded slowly. "I'm sorry." Accepted. That was the entire conversation. No raised voices, no lecture, no resentment. By dinner, the matter was finished. Or so I thought. The next morning, I found an envelope on the kitchen table. Inside was $50. No note. I already knew who had left it. When Lauren came downstairs, I held up the envelope. She looked embarrassed. "I thought maybe—" I smiled. "I know what you thought. I broke the agreement. You apologized. I still wanted to contribute." I handed the money back. "This isn't a fine." She hesitated. "No?" "No." I folded the envelope and placed it beside her coffee mug. The purpose of boundaries isn't to collect penalties. She looked down at the envelope for several seconds before quietly putting it back into her purse. I don't think either of us mentioned it again. The following week, Mike began leaving before sunrise. The maintenance company had added weekend work repairing several office buildings before new tenants moved in. He looked exhausted, but he also looked hopeful. One Saturday afternoon, he came home carrying a small notebook. He spread it across the dining room table after lunch. Columns, dates, dollar amounts, bills, savings goals, estimated apartment costs. I recognized the handwriting immediately. His mother's. Mike noticed me looking. "I found one of Mom's old budgeting notebooks." I remembered it well. Every January, Ellen would buy a plain spiral notebook from the drugstore. No fancy software, no spreadsheets, just careful handwriting. She tracked every dollar. Not because we were poor, because uncertainty frightened her more than sacrifice. Mike ran his finger down one of the pages. I forgot she wrote everything down. So did I. He looked thoughtful. I've been trying to solve everything by earning more. And? I never asked where the money was going. That afternoon, he spent 3 hours reviewing every expense his family had made over the previous 6 months. Nobody told him to. Nobody watched over his shoulder. Sometimes people change because someone lectures them. More often, they change because reality finally becomes impossible to ignore. Later that evening, Lauren joined him at the table. I wasn't trying to listen. I simply happened to be reading in the living room nearby. There was no argument, no blaming, only long pauses. Occasionally, one of them would write something down, cross something out, calculate again. Near bedtime, Mike came over and sat in the chair opposite mine. I owe you an apology. What for? I kept thinking getting out of debt meant making more money. And now? I think it means making fewer excuses. That sounded more like the son I had raised. The next Sunday after church, Frank stopped by carrying a box of apples from his brother's orchard. Frank and I had lived on the same street for over 20 years. He had seen Mike grow up. He had attended Ellen's funeral. He knew when to ask questions and when to pretend the weather was interesting enough. We sat on the back patio while the children played catch in the yard. Frank watched Ethan throw the baseball. He's getting better. He practices. Frank nodded. Then, after a long silence, he asked, "How's the arrangement working?" I thought about the question before answering. Better than I expected. Agreement helping? It turns out paper isn't what keeps people honest. What is? Conversations before assumptions. Frank smiled. Ellen would have liked that answer. I hope so. He looked toward the backyard where Mike was showing Emma how to catch a fly ball. They staying longer? I don't know. You ask? I don't need to. Frank raised one eyebrow. I pointed toward Mike. He had taken out his phone and was measuring something with a calculator while watching the children. I think he's already planning to leave. Frank followed my gaze. After a moment, he nodded. That's usually a good sign. When he left that afternoon, I found myself thinking about something he had once told me years earlier, after retiring from the sheriff's department. The best family disputes, he had said, are the ones that never become disputes. At the time, I hadn't fully understood what he meant. Now I did. Most serious conflicts don't begin with one terrible decision. They begin when small misunderstandings are ignored because everyone hopes they'll solve themselves. Boundaries don't prevent love. They give it somewhere safe to live. That evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I walked through the quiet house as I always did. The front door was locked. The kitchen lights were off. The hallway was still. As I passed the guest room, I noticed a sheet of paper taped neatly to the inside of the door. It wasn't for me. It was Ethan's handwriting. In large, uneven letters, it read, "Apartment Savings." Below it was a hand-drawn thermometer with numbers climbing toward a goal. Every Friday, he had written, the family would color in another section, not because they wanted to leave, because they wanted to go home. I stood there longer than I expected. Then I quietly turned off the hallway light and went to bed, hoping they would reach the top sooner rather than later. By the time November arrived, the house no longer felt crowded. It simply felt temporary. There is a difference. Crowded houses make people impatient. Temporary houses make people careful. Everyone in the family seemed to understand, without ever saying it aloud, that we were moving toward an ending. The question was no longer whether Mike and Lauren would leave. The question was when. Their savings chart on the guest room door slowly filled with blue marker every Friday evening. Ethan took the responsibility seriously. Emma insisted on coloring the last few inches each week, even if she wandered outside the lines. I never asked how much money they had saved. Mike never volunteered the number. Some things are easier to accomplish when nobody is watching your progress. One Saturday morning, Mike came home carrying a small cardboard box instead of groceries. He placed it on the kitchen table and looked at me with the uncertain smile of a man hoping not to be misunderstood. I found something. Inside the box were old tools from a garage sale. A tape measure, 2 screwdrivers, a level, a claw hammer, and a pair of pliers that had seen better days. "They're nothing special," he admitted, "but they'll get me started." I looked at the worn handles and rust spots before looking back at him. "What are you starting?" "I've been doing small repair jobs on weekends. A few of the guys from work have been recommending me to their neighbors." He shrugged almost apologetically. "It isn't much yet." "It doesn't have to be." For the first time since arriving, he wasn't talking about surviving the month. He was talking about building the next year. That afternoon, he loaded the tools into the back of his truck and left to replace a broken deck railing for an elderly couple across town. When he returned just before dinner, he was tired, dirty, and smiling. "They already asked if I could come back next weekend." I nodded. Good work usually gets invited back. Lauren was changing too, though her changes were quieter. She no longer worked at the dining room table. One afternoon, I found her sitting at the small desk in the guest room with headphones on, her laptop balanced beside the window. She had rearranged nothing. She had simply adapted. Later that evening, she knocked softly on the den door while I was reading. She handed me a folded piece of paper. "I wanted you to have this." It was a printed copy of the original guest agreement. Every page was still perfectly flat. At the bottom, she had written one additional sentence in blue ink. "Thank you for making expectations clear before misunderstandings had the chance to grow." Nothing else. No long apology, no emotional speech, just one sentence. I folded it again and placed it back inside the folder where the original agreement had been kept. A week later, Mike asked if I had time to drive somewhere with him. We spent nearly 2 hours looking at apartments. The first smelled strongly of fresh paint trying to hide old water damage. The second was too expensive. The third was small but clean. 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, a playground across the street where Emma immediately spotted another little girl riding a scooter. Ethan walked from one bedroom to the other, counting his steps. Mike stood in the empty living room, saying almost nothing. On the drive home, he finally spoke. "It isn't as nice as the house." "No, but it feels possible." "It should." He kept both hands on the steering wheel. "I wanted something I could afford, even if work slowed down again." I looked out the passenger window at rows of modest neighborhoods passing by. Years earlier, Ellen and I had said almost the exact same thing while standing inside our first home. It had needed new flooring. The roof leaked around one chimney. The furnace made alarming noises every winter. But it had been ours. There is a certain kind of pride that only comes from locking the door to a place you earned yourself. The following Thursday, Mike signed the lease. He told the children over dinner. Ethan grinned immediately. Emma asked whether her rabbit would get its own room. Lauren laughed and said, probably not. Nobody cried. Nobody celebrated too loudly. It felt less like escaping and more like arriving. Moving day came the first Saturday in December. The weather had turned cold enough that everyone could see their breath while carrying boxes. Frank came over before 8 with his pickup truck. 2 neighbors from Mike's new job arrived an hour later without being asked. By lunchtime, nearly everything had been loaded. I carried lighter boxes while pretending my knees were stronger than they really were. Nobody commented on it. Family sometimes means allowing another person to keep a little dignity. The guest room slowly returned to itself. Fresh sheets, empty closet. The savings chart disappeared from the door. Only a small square of tape remained until I peeled it away. Near the end of the afternoon, Mike walked into the garage alone. When he came back out, he was carrying the old wooden workbench that had belonged to my father. It wasn't large, just sturdy, solid oak with burn marks near one corner from a soldering iron decades earlier. He set it back down. I almost loaded it. You noticed? He nodded. I realized it wasn't mine. I smiled. No. He looked at the bench for another moment. I think that's something I finally started understanding. Before I could answer, he reached into his truck and brought out the small box of secondhand tools. He placed them on the workbench. I'll build my own. I rested one hand on his shoulder. I believe you will. By late afternoon, the moving truck was gone. The driveway was empty again. The house became quiet in a way it had not been for almost 3 months. I walked from room to room without any particular reason. The hallway echoed slightly. The refrigerator held fewer drawings. The living room seemed larger than I remembered. It also seemed lonelier. I had wanted my house back. No one tells you that getting something back is not always the same as enjoying its absence. That evening, I heated leftover soup for dinner. Out of habit, I reached for 5 bowls before realizing I only needed 1. Old routines leave more slowly than people. 3 weeks passed. Winter settled over the neighborhood. One Saturday afternoon, someone knocked at the front door. Mike stood outside holding a toolbox. Not the second-hand one, a new one. Nothing expensive, just clean, scratched from use rather than age. I've got a couple of hours, he said. Thought I'd fix that loose gate before it gets worse. I stepped aside. He worked in the backyard while I raked the last of the leaves that had collected along the fence. Neither of us talked much. We never had to. When the gate swung smoothly again, he packed up his tools and washed his hands at the backyard faucet. Before leaving, he handed me a small envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. At the top was a list: utility deposit, security deposit, first month's rent, emergency savings, credit card balance. Every item except one had a line drawn through it. The remaining balance was circled. Almost there, he said. I folded the paper. I'm proud of you. He nodded once. I know. Then he climbed into his truck and drove home. Not back here. Home. Months later, after the holidays had come and gone, I opened the desk drawer looking for an insurance document. The guest agreement folder was still there. I read through the pages one more time before placing them back inside. The paper itself had never protected my house. It had protected our relationships. Without clear expectations, resentment would have quietly replaced gratitude. Every small misunderstanding would have become evidence against one another until nobody remembered where the real problem had begun. People sometimes think kindness means saying yes to everything. My experience has taught me something simpler. Kindness needs structure, just as surely as a house needs walls. Walls are not built to keep love out. They are built so the people inside have a place where love can stay. Mike still comes over some Saturdays. Sometimes we repair something around the house. Sometimes we drink coffee and watch the neighborhood wake up. Occasionally, Ethan and Emma race through the backyard exactly as they did during those 3 months they lived here. The difference now is almost impossible to notice unless you know where to look. When evening comes, they gather their coats, climb into their parents' car, and drive to a place that belongs to them. And every time I lock my front door after they leave, I feel grateful for 2 things at once: that I opened it when my family truly needed help, and that we all knew when it was time to close it again.